Hello, I'm Matt Donnelly, and once again, we are previewing another Thursday night football matchup. This time, the Las Vegas Raiders versus the Los Angeles Rams. Ever since Derek Carr took to the podium just a few weeks back, the 5-7 Raiders are undefeated in 3 consecutive contests. This week, they head to Hollywood to take on the injury-depleted 3-9 Los Angeles Rams. And all I gotta say is barbecue chicken. That and break down the rest of this tale of the tape between the Raiders and the Rams, starting first with the quarterback position there and Derek Carr. Now, it'll be important to keep an eye on the Rams injury report ahead of Thursday night, especially as it pertains to Aaron Donald's status. Over the last 4 weeks, the Rams have allowed 8 passing touchdowns, 1,185 passing yards, and the 9th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. Donald, even at 60%, can wreak havoc on an offense all by himself. The Carr and Adams connection, it is the real deal, and it has been heating up. And don't look now, but after a slow start, Derek Carr, he has 20 touchdown passes, which are the 7th most in the National Football League, and his 2,980 passing yards, that currently sits 8th. Now, those numbers haven't necessarily translated into fantasy production, but it's coming. Carr hasn't been afraid to grip it and rip it. Having Devante Adams there, it helps, but his 8 completions of 40-plus yards, that is the 5th most in the league. Now, historically on Thursday Night Football, Carr has been pedestrian there. At 3-5, he's thrown for 1,727 yards, completing just 58% of his passes. However, his 7 touchdowns to 1 interception ratio, that is something to be proud of there. That was before Devante Adams, a little bit before DA, so to speak, there, before Adams arrived on the scene. So you know this combination, it simply cannot be stopped right now. The Raiders' offense literally is, it's not hard to figure out. It's throw to Adams and run the ball with Josh Jacobs, and it works, and there's not a dang thing that defenses have been able to do to stop it in recent weeks. Over the last 4 weeks, Carr is the QB6 in fantasy, having thrown for 1,100 yards and 9 touchdowns. Now, on the other sideline, we got John Wolford. Wolford last week was woeful there, 14 of 26 for 178 yards and a pair of interceptions. Not to mention, he had his ankle stepped on pretty good as well. Yet you still have to feel that this is the best option the Rams have under center, especially after seeing Bryce Perkins the week previous go 13 of 23 for just 100 yards. Wolford's 22.4 quarterback rating last week ranked 25th, and this week he gets Max Crosby, who's 10.5 sacks, ranks 4th in the NFL, and the addition of Jerry Tillery seems to have freed up Chandler Jones, who had 3 sacks and 11 pressures last week. Good news, though, for Wolford. On the season, the Raiders are allowing the 2nd most fantasy points on a per-game basis to the quarterback position at 20.7. The bad news, outside of an already depleted wide receiver room, the Raiders have improved on that over the last 4 weeks, allowing just 17.9 fantasy points per contest. On Tuesday, the Rams were awarded, that doesn't really sound right, Baker Mayfield off of waivers. Maybe they take a small victory keeping him away from the 49ers, or perhaps they did the 49ers a solid. Either way, Mayfield is a Ram for the final 5 games of the season. I'm not sure if he dresses in this one, but short notice, I'm thinking probably not. Then again, he hasn't really dressed much of the season. If Donald is unavailable, then all eyes will be focused on a potential offensive player of the year versus an all-pro there, as Josh Jacobs and Bobby Wagner are almost guaranteed to meet in that 2nd level on more than one occasion, especially considering that Josh Jacobs has been averaging 5.4 yards per carry this season. Hey, laugh it up if you will there, as I referenced Josh Jacobs as a leader in the Offensive Player of the Year clubhouse, but his 1,303 rushing yards are more than 184 more than Nick Chubb, who is 2nd in rushing the season. When you think you have Josh Jacobs all lined up, think again. 940 yards this season have come after contact. Add in 42 more receptions and 334 more receiving yards, and you have a back who's very well on his way to a 2,000-yard scrimmage season. Right now, Josh Jacobs, he is sitting at 1,634 scrimmage yards, while Tyreek Hill is the next closest player in that category at 1,409. Who needs practice? Now, Cam Akers, he probably needs a little bit of practice there, as he's been slowly coming back from that Achilles injury. Akers seems to be more involved in this offense after scoring a touchdown and rushing for 60 yards last week. Then again, who's really left in this offense to contribute? Since week number 10, Akers has been 16th in yards after contact per attempt and 10th according to PFF's elusive rating amongst the running back position. And that is arguably behind the worst offensive line in the entire league. Akers earned an 82% opportunity share while playing 72% of the snaps last week compared to Kyren Williams there, who had just 28%. Akers, hey, he also ran a route on 54% of the Rams dropbacks. Akers and the Rams will be facing a Raiders defense that did a pretty good job bottling up Austin Eckler and the Chargers run game last week, limiting Eckler to 3.5 yards per attempt on 10 carries. That said, including that contest last week, the Raiders are allowing the 8th most fantasy points this season to the position, allowing 36.6 over the last 4 weeks. They're allowing 356 yards on the ground and an additional 216 yards to backs in the passing game, not to mention the 5 total touchdowns in which they've allowed. Looking at the running back position from a fantasy perspective as it pertains to the Raiders defense, in those last 4 contests, Austin Eckler, he managed to still get 13.2 fantasy points. The combination of Kenneth Walker and Travis Homer, they added up for 30.2 fantasy points. Latavius Murray and Melvin Gordon, they combined for 29 fantasy points. And Jonathan Taylor, he had 24.3 fantasy points against this Raiders defense himself. With that said, why do I feel that we'll be talking about Kyren Williams as a waiver wire ad next week? This Rams backfield has been a mess all season long for fantasy managers. Now, who hasn't been a mess, who's been almost a guarantee each and every week? How about Devante Adams? Devante Adams versus Jalen Ramsey is another one of those matchups that is worth the price of admission alone. It was fun watching Ramsey versus DK Metcalf in that count and mouse game there last week, where Ramsey, he did a pretty good job one-on-one until that last score of the day. Since week number 9, Adams leads the NFL in fantasy production, producing 149.4 fantasy points in the last 5 contests, which is more than 34 fantasy points, more than what Justin Jefferson has done in that 5-game window as well. I did the math for you. That works out to 29.9 fantasy points per game. In those 5 contests, Adams was held to under 120 receiving yards just once, and that was a 7-catch, 74-yard performance against the Seattle Seahawks. Heading into week number 14, Adams is on pace for 112 receptions, 191 targets, 17 touchdowns, and 1,660 yards receiving. And Raiders fans, just in case you're wondering on that relationship between Devante Adams and Derek Carr, Adams had this to say: "That's like my real brother almost. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Derek." So take that as what you will. Now, the other wide receiver for the Raiders that could have some fantasy appeal is Mac Hollins. Help could be on the way here in just a few weeks as both Hunter Renfrow and Darren Waller are closing in on a return. However, with that short week being this week, it's not going to be week number 14. Week 15, on the other hand, that is a strong possibility. Now, until then, don't forget about the Mac attack, as Hollins has contributed 566 yards receiving on 45 receptions this season. That's not bad. Now, if the Rams send a little extra attention to Devante Adams, which I'm not even sure that's going to help at this point, then Hollins has proven that this season that he can produce any given week, as he has 5 weeks this season in which he has posted over 50 receiving yards, including that week 3 performance against the Tennessee Titans there, where he had 158 on 8 catches. Hollins, he has seen at least 5 targets or more in 4 straight contests, and he has manufactured at least 10 fantasy points in at least 6 of 11 games so far this season. Los Angeles, hey, the Rams, they have struggled these past 4 weeks and in the season in general when it comes to preventing fantasy points at the wide receiver position. In the last 4 weeks, they've allowed 780 yards receiving and 5 touchdowns and an average of 42.5 fantasy points to wide receivers. Now, we got to talk about these wide receivers for the Los Angeles Rams, and there's really not a whole lot to talk about because there's not a whole lot left there, as the Rams have lost their top receiving options there in Cooper Kupp and Allen Robinson, both on the IR earlier this season. Not to mention their quarterback, Matthew Stafford. He's not coming back anytime soon. So any resemblance of a passing game is probably accidentally on purpose, I guess. For Van Jefferson, the usage, that's going to be there. However, the production has not necessarily followed. Van Jefferson had just 2 grabs and 39 yards last week, even though he logged 100% of the snaps. Now, the week prior to that, hey, there was a pair of touchdowns there, so there is some reason to maybe get excited. I mean, I don't know if there's a Rams receiver you really trust right now. Now, with no Cooper Kupp or Allen Robinson, Jefferson is technically the best option that the Rams have in this passing game, regardless of whoever is under center. Now, I think for me personally, I'm kind of an avoid any Rams receiver at all costs situation. Now, the other receivers that we should probably touch on, Brandon Powell there, Tutu Atwell. Who? Now, Tutu Atwell, He had 2 catches for 48 yards and 23 rushing yards on 4 carries, while Brandon Powell had respectable, 4 catches, 39 yards, and 45 yards rushing on 3 carries. That pretty much led this Rams offense a week ago, if you really want to call it that. Now, in Powell's defense, he came up just a yard short of scoring a touchdown, which would have produced a very respectable 18 fantasy points, as he did earn a career-high 90.1 PFF grade, so there's always that. A lot has been made about attacking the secondary for the Raiders. That hasn't been great, but you know what? They haven't been terrible. They've allowed 34.7 fantasy points per game, which sits as the 16th most or the 17th fewest, depending on which way that you want to look at it. A reason they are allowing what they have allowed is the fact that they've yielded the 11th most receiving yards, 669 to receivers in the last 4 weeks. But then they've only surrendered 3 touchdowns. Now, as far as tight ends go, the whole tight end position is just ugly in general. Foster Moreau, he's in the concussion protocol. Jesper Horsted, he's got some injuries of his own that he's dealing with. Darren Waller, he's out this week, maybe coming back in week number 15. And then you got Jacob Hollister. Well, he's still Jacob Hollister. If Moreau is cleared from the concussion protocol, those who are streaming tight ends this season, Moreau becomes a very attractive option. I just don't know on the short turnaround, being a Thursday night football game, if that is going to even be possible, which is very unfortunate considering that Rams are allowing 18.5 fantasy points per game in their last 4 contests, which includes 3 touchdowns and 261 yards. And the only other tight end to even mention this contest, it's Tyler Higbee. Higbee may be the best option in this Rams offense facing this Raiders team that just gave up 80 yards on 5 receptions to Gerald Everett just a week ago and 242 yards to tight ends over the last 4 weeks. However, Vegas, they haven't allowed a touchdown to the tight end position in that 4-game window. And Higbee, he's coming off just a 2-catch, 15-yard performance a week ago. Higbee has 50 receptions for 444 yards. His 444 receiving yards is the second most in the NFL right now for a player who has not scored a touchdown. If you're looking to score more, you need to head to fantasypoints.com. They got you covered. Get that subscription. Save 10%. Use promo code 22Vipers10 and thank me later. And we will see you next week.